We're back with the League of the Genuine Conversations with me, your host, Fred Mwema, the only show on the planet where we discuss the important but often ignored subject of counterfeits. Once again, I have a special guest. We are out here in Rubaga Road, Bukandula Hotel, where a land friend of mine has been kind enough to invite me here to interview him. And we had taken a break. We have been following up all the episodes we've had. I've been covering the events in Mbale, where we had a successful song audition for the Fex Desk launch as well, where we have used music to present and promote the message of counterfeits in agriculture. But we resume our normal programming. I have a special guest, Mr. Doctor to be. Maybe I should call you a doctor already.
Doctoris.
Okay. The good thing, he's not faking about it. He's doing his doctorate, but he's not calling himself a doctor.
No.
Some people are not even doctors, and already they are saying they are doctors.
True.
And because this show is against counterfeits, we appreciate the fact that Mr. Isaac Christopher Lubogo is here with us. Mr. Christopher Lubogo, you are welcome. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you. Again, when I use the word senior, I hope I'm also not doing counterfeit.
No, you're not.
Because I know senior is also something that is given by virtue of the Chief Justice and following certain procedure guidelines. But I'm exceedingly humbled and honored to have this interaction with you, particularly in respect with counterfeit. And I know where you're coming from in terms of counterfeit. When you talk about Africa, then, man, there's everything about counterfeit to talk about. So, about myself, my name is Isaac Christopher Lubogo. I am Musoga from Bulamoji, Gadumire Wuyuge, which you call half London. I hold a Bachelor's of Law, Master's of Law, and I'm doing a PhD in psychology and philosophy, and also doing a doctorate of law at the same time doing a PhD in law. So I'm doing 3 at the same time. I think it was in 1871 where Ralph Waldo Emerson said that if a man can build a better house or make a better mousetrap than his neighbor, even if they build a house in the woods, the world will make a beaten path to his door. That will become increasingly true. So I know that one of the reasons why you came is for us to have a discourse in terms of intellectual discourse that has to do with issues that have to do with counterfeit. And for all intents and purposes, I think that is a subject that no one can take for granted. So I must thank you. I must thank you, Council, for studying this, and I'm reliably informed that you've been doing this for the last 15 years or so. I think it's groundbreaking, and we should applaud you and encourage you to do greater things than this.
Okay, thank you, Isaac. I will call you Isaac for the purpose of
the
show.
No
problem. Before we go further, Isaac, we have an international symposium on intellectual property and protection and enforcement of intellectual property in Nairobi. We are working with the Anti-Counterfeit Authority of Kenya. In Kenya, they have a government agency. In Uganda, we don't have. We have the SCN. But this symposium is bringing all the who is who in the protection of intellectual property down to Nairobi. I am hoping that I can send an invitation on air now to you, if you can come and participate and see what we as Africa are proposing to do in countering this menace.
Absolutely.
So I think that's enough for the introduction. But you are an academic. You told me you are executive or principal of the Petroleum Institute.
Yes.
You are a lecturer. You are doing 3 doctorates at the same time. There is a saying, a derogatory saying, but it's said that if you want to hide something from an African, put it in writing. You have written over 40 books. They are spread out here. What are you hiding from fellow Africans?
That's an interesting
And first
one.
of all, is it true that we don't read?
Well, it's a question of debate in terms of what used to be the trend as opposed to what is the trend now. If you permit me, I'll tell you a story of Willie Lynch. in America, there used to be our brothers and sisters that once upon a time were gotten hold of and sold into slavery, if you remember that time.
Yeah.
And they were taken and given up to different islands. And some slaves were becoming a problem in a particular area because they were revolting every now and then. But there was this guy called Willie Lynch. The word Lynch came from his second name. So when you see the word Lynch in the dictionary, you think that means, diabolical or bad methods of approach or treating individuals. But this came from the individual, how he used to take hold of the slaves. So the one time they brought him to America because the slaves in America were so rebellious, and it asked them the question, how were you able to keep these guys in order? And told them, get a nigger, like they used to say. They used to call us black niggers, or they call us even now black niggers. Put him in front of the young niggers, black children, female, tear his skin off, do it in front of the black niggers, tie one hand, one leg on a horse facing opposite direction, do the same, one hand, one leg on another horse facing the opposite direction, beat this nigger so bad, beat the horses so that they can tear this guy into pieces, set fire under his private parts, set dogs onto the women so that they can bite off their private parts and their breasts. Do it in front of the black niggers, and then put the fear of God in them. Take the mind, keep the body, so that it can be useful for future generation. So everything that you see here comes from what a great man one time said, most men see things as they are and ask why. The great Bernard Shaw. I look at things that are not and ask why not. So when I look
you
at...
express it
Absolutely.
in writing.
I do express that in writing. So many of the things that you're going to see here are groundbreaking books. These are things that are not there. And yet there is a reason why we need to reason it that way. That's why I told you that every strive I do in my life is to make sure that I put back what they call your righteous mind. I cause you to think so that we go against, I think it was Marvin Garvin who said that the world has made black people a vice. I intend to make it a virtue. So the world has made black people not to believe in ideology of intellectualism or the idea of thinking outside the box. My idea is to make you think and think outside the box and throw the box away.
Think to make yourself better. So for those who don't know, what do you write about?
I write basically everything that itches my heart in terms of novelty. Most of the books that we write about don't come because so-and-so has written about it. If you look at all the books here, no one has written about those particular books. If I find someone who has written about something, my assumption is that perhaps there's something good enough. So we go into what they call uncharted waters. We write things that have never been seen and heard of for purposes of creating an avenue. Because listen, my brother, Counsel Moema, time is gone where people are going to rely on doctrines of dogma. As it was, so shall it be forever. This is a time to charter new waves. The world is moving at a very supersonic speed. And the only way you can be left behind, if you begin gazing in old dreams of melancholism that were propounded by ideologies that have been taken over by event, perhaps that is something that you're going to ask about that has to do with National Council of Higher Education in terms of the curriculum that we have today. Most of the things, Mr. Moema, you're aware, you did constitutional law, that most of our laws are incepted by virtue of the order in council, in reception cause. All those things, we're arguing about things that were simply grafted on us, things that did not come within us and resonate out of us so that they can be able. So if you're talking about African Renaissance or African recollection or African Renaissance, you have met the gentleman who propounds that ideology, sir.
An African Renaissance, when we Africans are drowning in counterfeits, how possible is that?
That's a good question. If you're talking about counterfeit, perhaps I think the only country that has a disclaimer as far as counterfeit is concerned is China. Because everything that China does is almost a counterfeit of something else. So when you talk about counterfeit, I agree with you, the ideology that things should be done in terms of novelty. But listen, Mr. Moema, we're going to miss the point and ask me how. Right now we're talking about ChatGPT and the technology of what ChatGPT is doing in terms of what it is able to blend. Right now I can go to ChatGPT and command it to write a poem, right? And it will generate a poem and I'll call it my poem. you could do the same to give you something different. Are you going to say that's a counterfeit? So counterfeit must be understood in terms of the transitions of what is happening today. If it's a question of replicating someone's ideology or passing over information by way of reducing on its performance or in terms of its quality, and therefore affecting the lives of people, I agree with you 101%. But then perhaps the bigger question is, what regulatory framework do we have today that is substantive enough to capture counterfeit? I don't believe in counterfeits because I know what they do. They reduce the standards, they give off fakes, and then they end up, reducing on the quality and the performance of. When we were young, if you remember, I know you're much probably older than I am, but I remember there are certain products that we used to depend on, made in England. When we were young in school, they used to call certain individuals who are extremely hardworking, chuma cha mudachi, because they knew that those were people who, whose products were dependable. Right now, if you want anything fake, they probably call you China, because that's the way to go. But again, the problem is, when we argue counterfeit, is it our own liking, or is it because of our socioeconomic standing, vis-a-vis the fact that we're not having a prudent regulatory system that can be able to capture and curtail all these challenges?
But before you go to the regulatory system, me and you, with the elites, the African elites, do you think we are doing enough to help, because we are the eyes of society? You think we are doing enough to help those who rely on us to fight counterfeits? I'll give you an example. I am sure you have heard that there has been not once, not twice, reported in international media that baby powder, a lot of it that we use here, there have been lawsuits in the US which have found that it has got certain substances that have active carcinogens that cause cancer. But we, the elites and the rest of the Africans, continue to use these baby powder products, and yet we can see and do nothing about it. Are we, the elites, responsible in a way, in your view, to the escalation of the counterfeit problem on the African market?
Edmund Bank said that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. I am proud that you're a good man and you intend to do something about it. Counterfeit, beginning from money, health products, food products, intellectual products in terms of copyrights and intellectual property, name it. All of them, as I said, have an effect, substantial effect, on the quality of the individual life. Right now, Uganda, for example, tried to do some clothing, if you remember, the time of AGOA. And we met a lot of opposition from some of those countries abroad, because their argument was that your product was not good enough to meet the standards in terms of, the product that you're going to send outside. And yet we day and night rely on them in terms of the products that they give us. So I would understand the question you're asking it as an African and as a person who comes from probably the same area in terms of where you thrive, of the dangers that we have as a nation in terms of our health concerns, like you rightly pointed out, the powder, the medicines themselves. How many times do we see medicines that are fabricated on the streets of Kampala, and branded with the very names that would replicate, those so-called good companies abroad, So even before we begin talking about the so many fake things and, that don't meet the standard, it's again a question of, socio-economic, but also perhaps ethical standards in terms of the individual. Because unfortunate for most of us, it's a question of survival for the fittest. We tend to live for the day rather than trying to live for tomorrow. Most of these people abroad create foundations that are going to be, propounded by or relied on by future generations in terms of young children. But for us, it's a question of, if it serves my purpose today, to hell with tomorrow.
So are you saying that, from where you are you saying that educated or non-educated, the African is suffering the same way against the menace of counterfeits? We, even with the elites, don't appreciate this problem. As we're speaking here, the elites are leaving the office, they are in the supermarkets, They are busy buying product A or product B. They cannot check the trademark. They cannot check the expiry date. We are just buying. We are being gullible. Is that a reasonable assessment of us?
Absolutely. I wouldn't agree with you any less than that. But again, I would understand why we come from that kind of reasoning and why, as a nation, listen, Senior Counsel, you're talking about a country whose GDP is about $851 annually. Replicate that in terms of month. That's about 270,000 a month. Now you and I, in spite of the fact that we are lawyers and we're talking about public servants, that's virtually what they're supposed to be getting. Leave alone the so-called minimum wage, which is 130,000 per month. Compare that in terms of survival. Would you expect for an ordinary Ugandan to go and look out for the genuine thing? Because this guy who's selling the so-called genuine thing has put a lot of inventive step, a lot of substantive information, whatever packaging, for purposes of making it, equitable, for lack of a better word. So we find ourselves prey, not deliberately because we wouldn't want better things in terms of better quality, but even because of our socio-economic standing.
But how do you explain the fact that we didn't have as many counterfeits on the market in the 70s and 80s and 90s when we were still poor, but we're not consuming counterfeits as much?
Yes.
Why do we consume them now, yet the economy has expanded? We're doing an economy now almost hitting 30, $40 billion, Is poverty, is the lack of money a reason for you to buy a dangerous product to kill you? Are we saying that we are justified because of poverty?
Poverty, but also ignorance. You see, an African would rather eat something and die today
or tomorrow, but survive today.
Absolutely. So that's the problem. So people don't mind so much about the issue of tomorrow. The question is, do I have what I have to make me go through today? And that is the problem. So even though I know deep within everyone's, if you go down the streets of Kampala, ask any ordinary person, say this is a fake, this is a real, what would you prefer? They'll tell you, I definitely want the good one. But because my socio-economic cannot support the so-called good one, I am obliged to do the fake. And then we have countries like China, which are saying, wait, we can do these things for you, to meet your standard. In China today, if you go to buy, perhaps, actually, they launched Apple. They launched an Apple iPhone in America today. The next day,
you have a version of
the very version of it in China and being sold in Dubai. Think about that instantly. So we're competing with the people who are ready to, because they know where their money is. So
Isaac, we need to take a break.
Right.
Let's take a break and come back with the second episode. We're back with the second segment. This is the League of the Genuine Conversations. I am here in conversation with Counsel Christopher Isaac Lubogo. You have so many accolades that you have won, one of which is Best Legal Researcher in Africa. As you know, counterfeits is a foremost problem for the continent. Is this an area that you've taken interest in researching on, or is it one that you are going to consider, seeing as counterfeits permeate every section of African society?
That's a very good question and very pertinent considering the subject that we're talking about. I have already captured a few things that have to do with counterfeit, especially in our book called Cyber Law, in terms of data protection rights and what you need to know in terms of protecting data and intellectual property, as it were. But on a broader perspective in terms of fighting counterfeits, I think that's a novel area, and I'm extremely impressed. Rarely would you find people like you who are well accomplished in practice and even in other areas who actually lend their weight in terms of doing exploitative things like this. And this is what I've been telling my friends and young friends from Law Development Center, that some of you struggle in terms of finding jobs and opportunities because you are failing to think outside the box. You have demonstrated by what you're doing now that I think these are novel areas. You're coming out with groundbreaking areas and you're trying to help the nation to fight one of the biggest problems that actually affects the ordinary Africans. We are prey. Because of our poverty levels and because of our ignorance level, everything as Africa has been chosen as the dumping slot. So many of the things in Africa are not even checked. You go down to the next pharmacy. In England or in Europe, you cannot even buy a mere Panadol if it has not been prescribed by a medical personnel. Here, I just walk through a pharmacy and ask for Viagra, and they'll give it to me instantly. How many times have we seen Viagra being put in other, drugs, and people tell you, go drink that one, it will do the magic for you. These things have got health, backfires on us without us knowing. They cause hypertension, they cause cancer. How many clothes do we find on the streets of Kampala where we get them, branded and being brought from America or where? Simply because they have been dumped over, forgetting that some of these people have even got contagious diseases. And we even forget that sometimes people who are malicious. One time I saw a clip of these things that we're using during COVID time. What are the things called?
Masks.
The masks. Where these guys were sneezing in them, stamping on their face, and we probably saw that, and then throwing them to us in terms of that. Things like polio, even in America, it was being used, it was weaponized, being put there and sent to innocent Africans, black Africans, and even Indians to advocate for their dissemination. But that's another, argument in terms of that. But what you're saying is true. So I see a bigger problem in terms of counterfeit, and I think, a very important policy perhaps. Government should actually come up with policy. You're talking about counterfeit products, but you're not even talking about the things that we use even in terms of building materials. The levels, the quantifications of whether or not these follow the standards of what UNBS, for purposes of how many times do we see buildings collapsing on us? How many times do we see kids being born with limbs or perhaps inadequate body supplies in their bodies because their mothers were not fed enough, or because their mothers were given wrong medical attention in terms of
so in other words, it's prevalent. But
it's prevalent.
As a researcher who has written on cyber law,
yes,
here at the League of the Genuine, we understand that the cyberspace, the Internet of Things, the e-trade, the e-commerce is a major purveyor, transmission line for counterfeits. What is your experience with e-trade as a tool for promoting trade, but also promoting trade in counterfeits?
One of the biggest hindrances in terms of e-commerce or digitalizations of sorts, if you want, is again the issue of counterfeit by way of piracy. It's incredible. I'll give you an example. Netflix, for example, you probably know Netflix. I pay Netflix for about $11 per month. I know someone who can get you Netflix free of charge. Think about that. I know many DSTV where you're actually paying a tune of about how many dollars, five or so. I know someone who can put it on your phone, on your gadgets or Android free of charge. So every now and then we have counterfeit that are manifesting themselves in different ways. It appears that every time someone comes up with an invasion, one of the biggest questions, by the way, perhaps one of the guys you need to interview is Professor, the one of the Covidex, Ogwang. You remember?
Yes.
One of the challenges is say that how are you going to beat counterfeits? Because you come up with this Covidex, and what are you going to do in terms of creating a standard for it? He said we will try to label our bottles and so that they have QR codes, so that when you put your phone on them, they reflect. But even in spite of that, there is still someone who is thinking over and above. Again, the question of counterfeit, first of all, is a moral question. It's an ethical question. It's also a legal question in terms of legislative framework. So those are challenges that you and I have to sit down and harness. But it's also something that has to do with the system of governance, because of the root of corruption that tends to thrive and propon these ideologies. You probably heard about the junk helicopters. You remember them? And what happened? How many billions of shillings did we waste to Belarus and pay and then come up with junk helicopters? So when you talk about issues with counterfeit, it's a very broad and wide scope. Even the fabrication of COVID. During the time of COVID, this is between me and you. I know I'm on air. A whole doctor came to me and said, this is our time to make money. Do you know why? Because when you walk in the hospital, all they did was to do a swab. When they do a swab, they do a viral swab. Now, a viral swab would not specifically get you the COVID. Because if you want the COVID, then you have to go a little bit into the DNA using the STR methods or finding out. But this one will simply give you and say, okay, there's a virus. So then they say that is COVID. And then they extort lots of money. People's titles were taken. So the whole idea of counterfeit and piracy is the question of great great urgency for this country.
Urgency. But let's talk about the urgency, about these literal works.
Yes.
40 publications.
Yes.
I don't know how many man hours you put in producing this.
Excellent question.
The ideation, the expression that you put it down in a fixed form. This is copyright that is protected.
Right.
And yet, we also have counterfeiting in terms of copyright infringement.
Absolutely.
As an author, as a publisher, how are you protecting your works?
Let me begin by saying this. One of the challenges I got some time ago when I was writing a book, Cyber Law, we have research teams under the sui generis team. One of the challenges I got was when we sent out as research people to do the, collecting information and data, some of the students whom we use from almost every university in this country, some of the best, some of them graduate summa cum laude, others magnum cum laude, came up and they they brought information to me, but this information was actually got from their classroom notes. I did not know that they were coming from classroom notes. So
what do you mean classroom notes?
Notes, classroom notes, yes.
Mm.
And then when I posted them, because one of my checks and balances for this is throw them up to the media so that people can easily pick out and say, by the way, has a problem. And we do that. We have corrected many mistakes by people coming up and pointing our fingers on certain typos and stuff like that. And one of the guys said, listen, you have actually plagiarized my information. That was my information. I said, oh, goodness me, is that right?
But your students, your researchers gave it to you.
Absolutely, I'm coming. And then I said, okay, let me have the courtesy of sending you the entire book. Please pick out that particular area that belongs to you. So she picked out about 20 pages and throw it back to me. So I asked the student, I said, where did you get information from? He said, this information comes from this book. I'm aware that very lecturer who lectures me got that information from this particular book. So
what was the credit given?
That's the question. So the question is whether would I acknowledge her as saying now, so and so, Mr. Mwema, I acknowledge that I've used your classroom notes, or I acknowledge the person where we all got the information from. I'm sure you're a Christian, or a good Bible reader. You know of the Gospel of Mark, Luke, and James. All of them, there's an argument that they all probably got from the same source because there's a correlation. I did some theology. A correlation in terms of the information that kind of resonates in the same way. So plagiarism, on the other hand, would mean carrying on something that rightly belongs to Mr. Mwema, and I call it as if it was mine, right? Yes. And that is definitely right. No one in intellectual property, no academician would like to carry over people's information and pass it over as their own.
So how do you protect yours? Do you have like a special, somebody can't copy?
That's a good question. One of the things that we did, even when we began sui generis law up, which won an award, you talked about awards, I didn't want to go there. I wanted to be like Dr. King. Dr. King, Martin Luther King, said one time, I don't want to be remembered by the many accolades that I've won, but I want to be remembered for having sounded the drum of justice. So if there's anything that I want to be remembered, it's not because of the so many accolades that I've won, but how I've been able to influence my brother and sister in terms of information. Every book you see here is readily available on Amazon, on Scribd, on Digital to Draft, on all repository, Makerere University repository, Nkumba repository, UCU repository, KIU repository, IUI repository, UMI repository. Go to Congress, University of Congress, all of those, we give them out free. Even the sui generis law app that was, by the way, helped because I engage incredible students. One of them is right over there. We sit with them and engage with them and we debate. And most of these ideas come out of what they call eureka moments. We are sitting here and an idea just drops. Yesterday I was coming and I said, wait a minute, why don't I talk about things to do with suing America? We know why, because I saw recently via WhatsApp where they were saying that now they wanted that stopped the speaker from actually going to America because he had presided over something to do with the anti-homosexuality, which, by the way, we have a book already called Strict Mythology. I've written about homosexuality even before it came into debate, and even gave them, when I was before Parliament, everything I spoke. I look at the petition that is propounded by the professors. Everything I spoke about, all the backfires I spoke about, is in that book, and I have already made it public, information. But to answer your question straight in terms of how do you protect, like I said, the best way to protect, obviously, is to put the word copyright, as you already know. But that is not substantive in any way, because our students, for example, most of these things are probably academic and intellectual, would like to rely on them. How are you going to That book called Objection, My Lord, you see that is called Objection, My Lord. That book, to publish only that book, one copy cost you 1.5 million shillings without me getting any time. But I have given all universities that copy free of charge. Now what we do, we give them on repositories for purposes of people to access them free of charge. So all these books are readily available at lubogo.org and suegeneslawup.com.
So Isaac, you must be very rich, because if you're spending 1.5 million on average to do each publication, and you've done over 40, you are basically donating knowledge. You are contributing to the stock of knowledge and understanding. This is how I should take it. You are a philanthropist.
That's a good point. A wise man one time said that what is the value of money except if it is shared amongst many? I come from that theology that believes that it's more blessed to give than to receive. When I give and help my brother Mwema, I can assure you it will be given back to me, a good measure, shaken, pressed, and run over.
Wow, that is the principle. But now the counterfeiter would like to take for free, manipulate, tweak it, make it to pass off like Chris Rubogo's work.
Absolutely. And do
you think that we have a big problem in the academia where you are? Do you see a lot of this copyright infringement?
Absolutely. Let me tell you in black and white. Even now when you go to law school, name any law school now. I have some professors whose names are not mentioned because I haven't got their consent, whose books are readily being photocopied in one of those jurisdictions, different jurisdictions. And yet, little have these guys got. By the way, if you want to be not so rich, with the exception of a few, go into writing, especially as an African. But if you want to make money...
Because they will just rip you off.
Absolutely. That was told me by Professor Dr. Kwagala, whom I'm sure you know. She was teaching law. She's now in the US. One time she was adjudicating a matter before a judicial officer, and the judicial officer advised and said, why don't you go into academia? Because I see you're going to waste your time with this litigation. Litigation, these days they used to say a good lawyer is the one who knows where to find the law. Not so. Now they say a good lawyer is the one who takes the judge for lunch. So that kind of ideology, the kind of thinking has changed.
So you're saying that even in our education circles, and we're going in the next episode to talk about something which has been trending, the expired degrees. But you are saying, as a precursor, that even in our education sector, the counterfeit subculture is well and alive.
If there is a better
way, through
way,
exam leakages, getting degrees without attending class,
absolutely,
not doing the exams and all this, you are saying it is present.
Everything about lack of indigenous original thought is in itself a counterfeit. And we will go there, like you rightly said. National Council, call whatever it is, even by the vacuum of the degrees and the curriculum review, everything that I'm going to point here is not being taught traditionally in law school. And yet, it's the future of tomorrow. So, the point that you're raising in terms of a challenge that the nation has in terms of intellectual counterfeit, call it what you want, is a real and visible one. And the only way we can fight that is, first of all, is to have ethics, first of all, to give credit where it is due, which is also scripture, but also be able to comprehend and enhance and protect people in terms of these copyrights. I have a book on music and the law, where people are struggling in terms of protecting their rights. Those musicians of yours, the blah blah blah, the John Blacks and the likes, produce songs today, and the next morning you see it in Hoima or in wherever. How are they going to rip off their sweat? These are things that we're talking about.
From their creations.
Absolutely. So,
but as we close this,
yes.
I think even you, the scholars, you have a fair share of blame in propagating or creating or providing a conducive environment for this literal counterfeiting, this copyright infringement, because some of the scholars, some of the lecturers have been involved in situations where they actually encourage, okay? You look at Sex for Exams campaign, leaking of exams and so on. The students are to blame, the lecturers are to blame, the university is to blame. You're now defending, you're in the dock defending the the teachers, the lecturers, the principals. What do you say to this?
It's an unfortunate event that if a nation stoops that low, then we have no legacy at all to protect in terms of continuity. So I clearly understand you, senior counsel, when you come from that premise and, put all those, rightly said accusation in terms of intellectualism in universities and how low we have gone. I'll give you an example of the remunerations perhaps that cause that in terms of the feedbacks that people are supposed to get, the lecturers, like you're rightly saying. A senior lecturer in law is actually earning, in private universities, is actually earning less than a teacher of arts in a secondary school, in spite of the fact that teachers of arts are actually asking for an increment in terms of their salary. Think about that. So how would you expect this guy, who is professing to be a senior lecturer in law, to survive at the end of the day? You understand? And then it has to be reflected in terms of publishing a book. History of Busoga, this book, just to produce one copy, one manuscript that has to be, cost me about 1.5 million shillings. Just this. Then producing 100 copies cost me 8 million shillings, just 8 copies. Think about that. Now, how are you going to write and propagate this information and give it when you are earning meager resources, when government doesn't even have substantive research institutes? The only research institutes that we have in Uganda are things like CRB, the one that is owned by Professor Mamdan, and then the Huripec, the one that's now owned, I think, led
very
by
limited in terms of how many can you take.
The one that is the Professor Olokas and the Dr. Zaharas and the Dr. Kabumba, and then the one that is the one that Professor Mbazira, Pilak, and then the one that is almost collapsed, the one that in
Isaac,
ECU.
as we end this episode, basically you are saying, you're going back to the very thing that you have been saying. For the common man on the street, survival, Counterfeits is providing a good prospect and allure to go in. You're saying also in education, it's again survival. The economics and sociology of everything is affecting this. But we need to take a break and come back into the big subject of the expired degrees. Let's take a break. We are back with the third and last segment of what is an interesting conversation here with Mr. Doctoris Lubogo Isaac. He is really touching, you're really touching a lot of nerve centers here. And you're speaking very openly, because many people, they will come on the show and try to be defensive and but it's matter of factly, with no gloves, basically. But let's now talk about the issue that has been trending of National Council of Higher Education coming up and saying there are more than 2,000 programs in universities, tertiary institutions that are not certified. The word is that are expired. And this has caused a whole hodgepodge, blame here, blame there. Who is to blame, according to you, for these expired degrees or programs? Is it the institution? Is it the student? Is it who is to blame?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Who is to blame? Let me first make this philosophical argument that, and please take it in good spirit, that by nature, when you're arguing counterfeit, by the very creation of our country, or Africa for that purpose, given the fact that it's an amalgamation of different entities that were never ordained in terms of nature to be that way, but was simply a collection of a white man's division and scramble of Africa, is in itself a creation of a counterfeit that has replicated itself in a system that has been grafted on a foreign entity rather than originating from innate and original things. And that in itself is a defense and is a failure of sorts. Because then when you breed a generation that virtually doesn't belong anywhere and has no right of claimship, then you're actually disassembling them in terms of survival skills.
Are you saying the lack of identity, like we have an identity crisis, that's why our degrees are expiring in our face as well?
Because you grafted or you were propounded on a system that has been colonial in nature. And even after you got independence, you still depended on them. Now there's what they call de-neocolonization of the kind of education system that we're undergoing or undertaking. The problem is that when you did the LLB, I'm sure the very subjects that you did, senior counsel, are the very subject that I did, are the very subject that my daughter in Makere is doing, are the very subject that my child in Budo is going to do. Why? Because of that ideology of dogma. So was it, so shall it be forever and ever. This ideology of not thinking outside the box and throwing the box away. Every time someone tries to think out of the ordinary, we stigmatize them. When your friend, Professor Ogwang, came out with COVIDX, you saw what happened. It's impossible for an African to do that. Why are you doing ABCD until the president came and gave him a hand? And what happened? COVIDX did the magic for us. So as long
but
as...
Isaac, I think the issue here is that we are managing our own education system. Whether it's grafted from up or down or west or south, we are managing.
Good.
We have a legal regulatory framework.
Good.
To manage the accreditation.
Good.
Of degree programs.
Absolutely.
How do we get ourselves in a situation where a university will admit students to a program well knowing or have the means of knowing that this program requires accreditation, maybe this program is under review, the accreditation has not been confirmed, and this program expires, and you allow kids to sit and write an exam on an expired program? You cannot blame that on colonialism.
It is. Ask me why. Because of the following reasons. People misunderstood National Council for Higher Education, and I'm surprised that people still argue that way. National Council for Higher Education came out and said, wait a minute, we have these courses, but they have expired. National Council of Education is a regulatory framework that governs, institutions of higher learning, right?
Yes.
So according to them, and according to their licenses, they are saying we agree. We are not saying you are not part of us. We are not saying what you're doing is wrong. They are not saying that. The problem came because there was one single lady who had actually applied to Cambridge because she wanted to
Bristol University.
Yes, one of those in Europe, because she wanted to do what? To do a master's there. And so they asked her to verify her papers. Now, Cambridge, as a unified center that accredits or unifies or sets a standard for, standards in terms of the courses, measured and said there was something wrong. Because as far as we are concerned, you are not with trends with us. And so they wrote back to National Council and they gave their opinion. So National Council, because of that challenge, they knew that it's going to open a can of worms. So the only way to awaken the public of sorts was to tell them, wait a minute, let's go back and rebrand or refurnish because we're having a problem. So National Council, his only problem is perhaps the fact that they have to do a door-to-door, a constant renewal, a constant remembrance or reminding of these institutions. And this has to take stakeholdership of almost all vice chancellors and maybe deans of schools so that they can sit down and
there's a procedure.
Yes.
If I own the university, there is a procedure that I have got to follow to apply. If it's a new program, I have got to meet certain protocols.
Absolutely.
And I know that if I applied for this program, it will have a shelf life of 10 years or 5 years. And after that period, I reaccredit. And the reason that I have seen for the National Council of Higher Education is that the reason they recheck these programs is to see if they are still relevant to the job market, to see that they have got the sufficient intellectual capacity, teaching capacity to ensure the program is sufficient.
Absolutely.
So the framework is there. So don't you think that it is again an aspect of counterfeiting, this counterfeiting that we see in all the other things that you've spoken about, that has infiltrated even in the university education programs to the extent that somebody who will be a principal or a chancellor of a university, well knowing or having the means of knowing that this program has not been accredited, will take money. Take money from you, Isaac, you sit a program, and then later they say this is expired. Speak from the perspective of a counterfeit. Who is counterfeiting? Is it the university? Is it the National Council that is failing in its duty? Where is the ball being dropped?
Like I said, for starters, from the beginning, I told you the very big problem begins from the very genesis of first of all, our so-called country and the creation of independence. Everything we are teaching right now, as I said, is simply an offshoot of a colonial legacy that was passed over us, and we have been adapting, using it on and on and on without rebranding. I'll give an example. National Council just sets parameters under which universities should operate. Now, they also understand very well, they know the socio-economic standing. They know, for example, that if you are to teach in university, you should have these qualifications. I'll give you an example. I can mention out of the 30 universities, perhaps, or so, that are teaching law, there's only one university, substantive university, which has more than 5 professors. And yet the minimum for you to make an accreditation of a law program should be at least 6 professors. Think about that. But all of them are there. What's the problem?
Because so you have schools of laws in various universities. Some don't even have a professor.
You go down there, and I will not mention them, but I'll tell you the fact. They don't have professors. You know, leave alone the fact that even the so-called tutorial assistants don't even have second degrees. Even the so-called senior lecturers don't even have doctorates. Makere recently said, now we're not going to bring on any other person on board until they have doctorates, programs. But then at the end of the day, you ask yourself, where are things to do with staff enhancement, things to do with helping the ordinary people to acquire the education they need within the time frame required. You go and do some of those courses in some universities, they'll take you a span of about 10 years, something that would ordinarily have taken you a span of about 2 years in other institutions. Credible institutions, by the way. So there's a lot that has to do with...
So you're saying that
yes,
we are just scratching the surface when we talk about expired degrees.
When
you are saying even in terms of staffing.
In terms of staffing, in terms of remuneration, in terms of enforcement, in terms of... we are lacking in every perspective, as it were. Even in terms of substantive materials that we're training our kids in school right now. If I'm to teach law right now, there are things that I'll be thinking about. Things like forensic law, things like cyber law, things like sports law, things like fashion law and design. When the last time I talked about someone, I know you saw a book about witchcraft and the law and you laughed. Do you know that people are doing PhDs in witchcraft and the law in European universities? People don't know. So that's ignorance of the populace.
They are studying
yes.
PhDs in witchcraft.
Yes. And
so they become witches, or what do you graduate as? A witch?
Don't you see? Now that is a very loose interpretation of the word witch. Because you see, witchcraft becomes an omniscient threat. You're a lawyer, you're an advocate. So you practice. And an omniscient threat, meaning it's ever present, not so. When you're arguing in terms of omniscient threats, then you know that this is something that is ever present. How do I react to it? What are the ingredients? If I plead the defense, for example, that there is a case in my book, Witchcraft and the Law, where the woman actually went and killed another woman because she suspected bewitched the man for not functioning well in the what? In the bed. And every time he only went to the other one, that's when the thing was doing what? Doing the magic.
Performing wonders.
So you see, all these aspects, how are you going to redress them? You have already this onboard. We have in a Witchcraft Act, by the way. I think you're aware.
Yes.
So some of the things, ignorance of the populace, ignorance of, and then the dogmatism of the. Many of the professors today and doctors are relying on what they call past intellectual glory, and that's the problem. You need to let young.
They are not up to date.
They are not researching.
They are not.
They are dogmatic. They only want to do things in their own way, and I'm not being offensive to anyone. Many of them are my colleagues and friends. But I'm just telling you that it's time to free this nation. Free ourselves and let's think outside the box and throw that box away. We need to come up with groundbreaking novel ideas. Things like you're talking about right now. Tell me someone who has written a book about counterfeit, or in terms of policies, in terms of migration policies, in terms of renewable energies, in terms of smart cities. I have a book here. You did, and I'm sure the book that you read in land law is the very book that is teaching law, called Mugamba. Not so.
Yes.
Here I'm talking about smart cities, smart energy, ecosystem, renewable energies. These are things that Uganda is not even mentioned among its smart. These are things that we are talking about. Media law and policy, forensic law. We need to think outside the box and throw the box away. So when you talk about issues with National Council, you don't simply blame National Council as an entity.
It is a whole ecosystem.
It's a whole ecosystem. It has to do with the very way Let me ask you another question, Senior Counsel. Think about this ideology of pre-entry, for example. Why do you think Makere started pre-entry? Actually, it's not even Makere that started. UCs that started pre-entry, you know, or for entrance into University of Law, what you call matriculation exams in other jurisdictions. They started it because they wanted to create it. Now they're not even assured of the kind of students you're producing in HSC. So they're saying, let's create a what? A pre-entry. You know, and then you find people smuggling themselves through. Now, these are questions that go to the root of the question. So we have to understand that everything that has to do with us, we need, I think, a neo-colonization of our education, debunking the entire education system, debunking the way of how we think, and, as I said, thinking outside the box and throwing the box away.
So are you saying this issue of expired degrees is ignoring to speak about even expired graduates who have been produced through a system that is not actually enabling them to be useful members in the job market?
Excellent point. Excellent point. Now that's the question. You end up producing graduates who, at the end of the day, are thriving or relying on education that has been propounded by particular individuals in class. I can mention about 5 people, and I'm not saying that is the modus operandi. People like the Bill Gates, people like the Mark Zuckerberg, people like the Steve Jobs, who actually dropped off from college, right, and refused to do their degree because they felt that it was, denying them their free thought. University should be an entity where there should be free thought. It should be an entity where it should encourage you to be a free thinker, to be like what Council Moema is doing right now, that I can do something over and above the traditional court system and engage in a debate like this, but at the same time educate the masses on things to do with counterfeit. That is what we are talking about. That's where the nation is going to be. Others will look at you and laugh. You know, when you come to situations in a country like Uganda where a whole university secretary of a major leading university, just 2 years after he has left, couldn't even get his pension and began selling in Swa and in Senene on the same institution and university. What do you call that, my brother? What do you call that? In publication, there is a saying that you either write, publish, or perish. Those are preambles that we operate on. How many books how many authors do you know in this country who have authored more than 5 books? Some of them with PhDs, but even their PhDs have not even published as yet. And I'm not offending anyone. The use of the value of education is not to give you that qualification that, you know what, I have these chapters on me because I am a graduate of sorts. No. How have you been able to churn that knowledge into something that is able to benefit the ordinary person? How can you change your nation? How are you adding value? Your education, does it help you? Does it make you a better individual? Or are you simply stigmatized and following certain trends? I know friends of mine who castigate and abuse me left, right, and center in terms of the authorship. I'm not competing with anyone. I'm not breaking records.
You're in your own race.
I'm in my own race. I'm only trying to do what I feel I can best do. How can I help my brother Moema to become a better individual in terms of what they do? If Mr. Moema critiques me and says, Isaac, your book is not reviewed or peer reviewed for that purpose, on what is peer review? It's a question of Mr. Moema saying, okay, let me fill you through your book, or say, okay, I'm well convinced that I thank you very much. I think it's a good one. And then you disqualify my books from being taken in incredible institution because they are not peer reviewed. Then the definition of peer review itself is lacking in itself. So we have so many things that we have to understand when you're talking about things to do with counterfeit and intellectualism and the important questions you're asking for the day.
So we need to close. I would have loved to continue this conversation on and on and on. But even a good dancer, they say, has to leave the stage.
Right.
What is your parting word, your message to the audience? Should we, as consumers, wait for government? Or do you feel we, as consumers, have a role to play in fighting against counterfeits?
I'll tell it in 2 stories. One, my father, the late Patrick Cunha, when he was studying in Newcastle, the University of Newcastle, after they had sat for the exam, the professor had given them the exam, they sat, they answered, and they walked back. And you know that time when you're walking back with your colleagues, you begin to talk about, how was the paper? By the way, I answered this question, I should have done this. This is how I should have done. And then you said, wait a minute. Do you know what? I missed that point. The professor taught us this. This is what should have been written in that question. What does my father do? He runs back to the hall, finds the white professor collecting the what?
The
The papers. He says, Professor, yes, what's it, sir? I think I have a problem. He said, what's the problem? That question you asked required me to do A, B, C, D. Said, and what did you do? Said, I did this. So he said, what makes you think you're wrong? He said, because when you taught us in class, this is what you taught. When I read this book, this is what it said. But I made a mistake. Oh my goodness. So I said, what's your name, sir? I said, Patrick, sit down. The professor got the bunch of papers, looked for my father's paper, tore it in front of my father, and said, you have passed. How many professors in Uganda would do that? Many of them would say, what? Choyagali dembazi, chibuyaga asudde. That's why you keep hearing those stories of yours of lifting the skirts and doing stuff like that to compromise. Ethics. The second story was told to me by Reverend Grimes of a young boy who wanted to buy a puppy. You know those puppies. And he came and he walked on the streets and found the guy selling the puppy. He said, how much is the puppy? He said, it's £1. He said, please keep it for me. Run home, get the £1. And just as he had run away, another guy comes and says, how much is the puppy? He says, £1. But someone is going to pay. He said, no, forget about that person. I'm going to give you 5. He said, no. I wait for the £1.
Wow.
Ethics, integrity is something we lack. You see, in life, we should be very careful. I think it was Pascal who said, you should be careful with your wants, because it's not the it that you want, it's the fantasy of the it.
So it is lack of integrity
Absolutely.
that we have ourselves enmasked in Counterfeits. I would like to thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Senior Counsel,
making the time to be a guest on this only show on the planet that discusses exclusively
Absolutely.
the subject of counterfeits. That has been me in conversation here with my friend Lubogo Isaac Christopher. We have been discussing the subject of counterfeits in the various forms and faces that it appears in. I hope that you have been able to learn a thing or two about this menace of counterfeits. If you like what we are doing, if you're new here, this is the only show on the planet where we talk about the subject of counterfeits. We would like to ask you to support us by subscribing to our channel. If you like, you can share, you can put a notification to be reminded about the next program that we have. Until then, don't be fake, buy and sell genuine.